A racist cop kicks a black couple out of a luxury hotel, only to regret it when she learns their secret. A black couple steps into a luxurious hotel, excited to enjoy a long-awaited evening of celebration. But instead of being welcomed, they're stopped by a security officer who accuses them of not belonging and demands they leave immediately. The public humiliation, the baseless accusations, it all seems too much. Yet, what happens next leaves the officer stunned and filled with regret when their secret is revealed. Have you ever been unfairly judged or seen someone face such injustice? How did it make you feel? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit as he glanced at Sophia, who was checking her reflection in the car window. Her evening gown shimmered subtly under the streetlights, a perfect blend of elegance and sophistication. Tonight was special. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a celebration of their shared success, a culmination of years of relentless work. As they approached the grand entrance of Le Grand, the imposing double doors swung open, revealing a glittering interior of chandeliers, polished marble floors, and softly glowing tables occupied by diners dressed to impress. The restaurant was the epitome of exclusivity, a playground for the city's elite. The maitre d', an older man with slicked-back hair and a practiced smile, greeted them. However, as his eyes landed on Ethan and Sophia, there was the briefest flicker of hesitation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ethan caught it. "Good evening," the maitre d' said, his smile slightly strained. "Name for the reservation?" "Ethan Carter," Ethan replied smoothly, handing over his phone with the confirmation email. The man scanned the screen, and for a fleeting moment, his brows furrowed. Then he straightened and gestured towards the dining area. "Right this way." Sophia noticed it too, the pause, the way his gaze lingered on them just a second too long. But she said nothing, deciding to brush it off as a mere misunderstanding. As they followed the maitre d' through the maze of white linen tables, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Conversations around them seemed to dip into a hushed murmur, eyes flickering toward them before darting away. It wasn't obvious or overt, but it was enough to make Sophia's stomach tighten. They were seated near the center of the room, a prime spot with a view of the ornate fireplace. A waiter appeared almost instantly, pouring water with mechanical precision before handing them menus. His polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Enjoy your evening," the waiter said before walking away briskly, leaving them alone with an unfamiliar weight in the air. Sophia leaned in slightly, her voice low. "Did you notice the way everyone's looking at us?" Ethan shrugged, trying to stay composed. "Maybe we're overthinking it. Let's just enjoy the night." But the unease refused to dissipate. As they scanned the menu, Sophia caught snippets of whispered conversations from nearby tables. Words were muffled, but their tone was unmistakable, curiosity tinged with judgment. "Did you see them?" one voice murmured. "They must be lost," another chuckled softly. Sophia's fingers clenched around the menu, and she glanced at Ethan, who was pretending to be engrossed in the wine list. Their waiter returned, his movements brisk. "Have you decided on a wine selection?" Ethan smiled politely. "What would you recommend to pair with the ribeye?" The waiter hesitated, his eyes darting around the room before replying curtly, "A Cabernet Sauvignon would do," and then left without elaborating or engaging further. Sophia exhaled sharply. "He didn't even try. Did you see how he just left?" Ethan placed a hand on hers to steady her. "Let it go, Sophia. We're here to celebrate. Don't let this ruin it." But the whispers continued. Glances stretched into open stares. A nearby couple exchanged knowing looks as if silently agreeing on an unspoken judgment. One man leaned in to whisper to his companion, and they both smirked. Sophia couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why are they acting like this? We made a reservation. We belong here just as much as anyone else." Ethan sighed, his patience beginning to wane. "It's their problem, not ours. Let's not give them the satisfaction of ruining our night." Yet, as the courses arrived, perfectly plated and undoubtedly delicious, the tension only grew. It wasn't just the guests. The staff seemed equally uncomfortable, their politeness laced with an undeniable distance. A waiter who had been laughing with another table moments earlier avoided eye contact with Ethan entirely as he refilled their glasses. Sophia tried to focus on the food, but her appetite was slipping away. "I just don't understand," she murmured. Ethan's jaw tightened. He felt it too, the invisible barrier, the silent message that they didn't belong. And though he wanted to ignore it, to rise above the pettiness, the weight of it all pressed down on him. Across the room, A man in a crisp suit whispered something to his dining partner, who covered her mouth as she laughed. Ethan's gaze hardened as he caught their eyes briefly before they turned away. "They're laughing at us," Sophia said, her voice trembling with both anger and hurt. Ethan shook his head. "No, they're not worth it. Let's finish dinner and leave." But deep down, he knew this wasn't going to be that simple. The hushed disdain, the subtle yet undeniable hostility. It all felt too orchestrated to ignore. And as Sophia's knuckles whitened around her wine glass, and Ethan's calm facade began to crack, they both realized the same thing. This night wasn't going to end quietly. The undercurrent of tension was no longer just an atmosphere. It was building into something far more pointed, far more personal. Ethan and Sophia were about to be confronted with a reality they hadn't expected, and it would challenge them in ways they were unprepared for. Sophia tapped her fingers lightly on the edge of the table, her eyes darting to the waiter at the adjacent table. He was chatting amiably with a group of well-dressed diners, laughing at a joke as he poured wine with a flourish. The contrast was glaring. When he returned to their table, his demeanor shifted instantly. His posture stiffened, his eyes avoided theirs, and his tone became clipped. "Are you ready for the next course?" Ethan glanced at Sophia before responding evenly. "Yes, we are. Can we also get your recommendation for dessert wines?" The waiter's lips twitched into the semblance of a smile. "I'll see what we have." He turned and walked away without another word. Sophia exhaled sharply. "It's not just me, right? He didn't even try to answer your question." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's probably busy, let's not read into it." But the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The atmosphere at their table felt colder, the service increasingly perfunctory. Sophia caught another couple at the next table glancing at them, their whispers audible even over the hum of the dining room. "Maybe they're here for a reason," the woman murmured, her voice laced with condescension. The man chuckled. "They don't exactly blend in, do they?" Sophia's face burned. "Did you hear that?" she hissed, her voice low but trembling with frustration. Ethan reached for her hand, trying to steady her. "Ignore them. They're not worth it." Just as he spoke, an older man in a gray suit strolled past their table, his pace deliberately slow. He looked down at them briefly, his expression neutral, except for the faintest curl of his lip. As he walked away, Sophia caught him muttering under his breath. This place used to have standards. Her chest tightened, the words landing like a slap. She looked at Ethan, her composure cracking. "I can't do this, Ethan. It's like they don't want us here." Before Ethan could respond, a young server, no older than 20, approached their table hesitantly, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry if you're feeling uncomfortable," she said, glancing over her shoulder. This isn't how it's supposed to be," Sophia frowned. "Then why is it happening?" The server hesitated, then straightened abruptly as another staff member passed by, glaring at her. "I'm sorry," she murmured again before scurrying away. Ethan sighed, his patience wearing thin. "This is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong." As the next course arrived, the tension only grew. The waiter placed their plates down with an audible clink, muttering a quick "enjoy" before retreating, without waiting to see if they needed anything else. Sophia clenched her fork. "It's not just bad service, Ethan. They're going out of their way to make us feel unwelcome." Ethan didn't reply immediately, his eyes scanning the room. A man at a corner table was staring at them openly, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Another diner whispered something to his companion, who glanced at them and laughed softly. The final straw came when a middle-aged woman, dressed in pearls and an immaculate black dress, paused near their table. She didn't say anything, but the look she gave Sophia, a slow, deliberate up-and-down appraisal, spoke volumes. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she turned and walked away. Sophia's hand slammed down onto the table, her voice low but fierce. "I'm done pretending this isn't happening." Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Sophia, let's just finish the meal and leave. We won't give them the satisfaction of thinking they've gotten to us." Sophia's eyes flashed. "They already think they've won, Ethan. Look around. No one here sees us as equals. They're just waiting for us to leave so they can act like we were never here." Her words hung heavy in the air. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sharp, authoritative voice from behind him. "Excuse me," the voice said, cutting through the low hum of the dining room. Ethan turned, his eyes narrowing as he took in the woman standing before them. She was dressed in a crisp security uniform, her posture rigid and commanding. Her name tag read, Clark. Sophia froze, her unease transforming into something closer to dread. "Is there a problem?" Ethan asked, his tone measured but with an edge of steel. Clark's eyes flicked over them, her gaze assessing and faintly disdainful. I'm here to ensure everything is in order. This section is reserved for our high-profile guests, and I need to verify that you belong here. Sophia's mouth fell open. What? We made a reservation. We've been sitting here for almost an hour. Clark didn't blink. I'm going to need to see your confirmation again, and I'll also need to verify your identification. Ethan's hand gripped the edge of the table as he forced himself to stay calm. We've already shown our confirmation. What exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Clark said smoothly, though her tone carried an unmistakable edge. I'm simply doing my job. Sophia's voice cracked with anger. Your job is to harass paying customers? Clark crossed her arms, her stance unyielding. My job is to maintain the integrity of this establishment. If you're legitimate guests, then you have nothing to worry about. Ethan stood, his height forcing Clark to tilt her head slightly to meet his gaze. We've done nothing wrong. If you have an issue, take it up with the manager. Clark didn't flinch. The manager is aware. I'm here to ensure compliance. Now, I'll ask again. Show me your identification, or I'll have to ask you to leave. Sophia rose to her feet, her voice shaking with fury. You're out of line. We're not going anywhere. The tension at the table was palpable, drawing the attention of nearby diners. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation. Clark's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, I'll have no choice but to call for additional security. From her position near the entrance, Officer Rachel Clark's sharp eyes scanned the dining room with precision. She'd been on security detail at Le Grand for years, entrusted with ensuring the restaurant's exclusivity remained uncompromised. To her, the establishment wasn't merely a fine dining venue. It was a fortress of prestige, a place where only the deserving elite belonged. When Ethan and Sophia entered earlier that evening, something about them set off alarm bells in Clark's mind. She couldn't pinpoint it at first, but as they moved with quiet confidence through the restaurant, it gnawed at her. They didn't fit her mental image of the clientele who frequented this place, and it unsettled her. Clark watched them carefully. Ethan's tailored suit and Sophia's glittering gown were immaculate, their poise undeniable. But instead of blending into the atmosphere of wealth and exclusivity, they stood out to her like a discordant note. She rationalized her growing unease. It's not about their appearance, she told herself. It's about maintaining the standard. If they truly belong here, there should be no issue. But if they don't, the thought lingered. She'd seen it before. Guests trying to pass themselves off as something they weren't. She convinced herself she wasn't profiling. She was safeguarding the restaurant's reputation. As Ethan and Sophia dined, Clark's scrutiny deepened. She observed how other diners glanced at them, how staff seemed to falter in their presence. It wasn't just her noticing something unusual, it was everyone. That, in her mind, validated her instincts. Clark crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. She'd dealt with situations like this before. People entering spaces they didn't belong in, disturbing the carefully curated image of exclusivity. She prided herself on her ability to spot such anomalies and act decisively. When the murmurs around the room grew more audible, she decided it was time to intervene. If they truly belong here, they'll understand. If not, it's my duty to handle it. With deliberate steps, she approached their table, her polished boots clicking against the marble floor. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Excuse me, she said, her tone crisp and authoritative, cutting through the low hum of conversation. Ethan looked up, his brows knitting together in confusion. Yes? Clark's expression was neutral, but her eyes betrayed her intent. I need to verify that you're supposed to be here. Sophia blinked, her mouth slightly open. Excuse me? Clark remained unmoved. I'll need to see your reservation confirmation and identification. It's standard procedure in cases like this. Ethan's voice was calm but firm. We've already shown our reservation at the entrance. Is there a problem? It's routine, Clark replied smoothly, though her words carried a hint of condescension. We need to ensure all guests meet the standards of this establishment. Sophia's hands curled into fists on her lap. Standards? She repeated, her voice rising slightly. Clark nodded, her gaze unwavering. This is a highly exclusive restaurant. We have to be diligent. Ethan's calm began to crack. We're paying customers? We've been here for over an hour. If there was an issue, shouldn't it have been raised when we arrived? Clark tilted her head slightly, her posture stiff. Sometimes discrepancies aren't immediately apparent. That's why I'm here now. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes flashing with anger. This is harassment. You're singling us out for no reason. Clark's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not harassment. It's protocol. Ethan stood, his height forcing Clark to look up slightly. "We've done nothing wrong. If you have a legitimate concern, call the manager. Otherwise, leave us alone." The quiet conviction in his voice seemed to catch her off guard, but she quickly recovered. "I'm authorized to handle situations like this," she said, her tone hardening. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have to escalate." Sophia rose to her feet as well, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "You're the only one creating a situation here. We've followed every rule. We're here to celebrate, and you're treating us like criminals." Clark's eyes narrowed. "If you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be an issue." Ethan took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. "We're not hiding anything. The issue here is your bias. You saw us walk in and decided we didn't belong. That's the real problem." For a split second, Clark's composure faltered, but she quickly masked it with a steely glare. "I suggest you watch your tone," she said coldly. "This is about maintaining order." Sophia let out a bitter laugh. "Order? The only thing you're maintaining is your prejudice. You don't see us as equals, and you can't stand that we're here." Clark's face darkened. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to call for backup." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Other diners were now openly watching, their expressions ranging from discomfort to curiosity. The once lively dining room had fallen eerily silent, the tension palpable. Ethan stepped closer to Clark, his voice low but firm. "Go ahead, call whoever you want, but know this, you're making a mistake." Clark hesitated, her authority challenged in a way she wasn't used to. She glanced around, noting the growing attention of the room. Her instinct was to double down, to assert control. "I'm giving you one last chance," she said, her voice colder than ever. "Show me your identification, or I'll escort you out myself." Sophia's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You're going to regret this." Clark raised an eyebrow, her confidence unshaken. "We'll see about that." With a sharp nod, Clark turned and strode toward the security desk. The escalation had reached a boiling point, and it was clear she intended to follow through on her threat. Clark returned to Ethan and Sophia's table, her steps deliberate, her expression void of empathy. Standing rigidly before them, she crossed her arms and delivered her words like a cold verdict. "You don't belong here." Sophia froze mid-sentence, her fork clattering against the plate. Ethan frowned, his tone measured but sharp. "Excuse me, what exactly do you mean by that?" Clark's gaze was unflinching. "This section is reserved for high-profile guests who meet our standards. You don't fit the profile." Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. "We've shown our reservation. That should be enough. Are you suggesting otherwise?" Sophia's voice broke through, trembling but firm. "This is ridiculous. You can't just walk up to us and accuse us like this. We've done nothing wrong." Clark's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "I need to verify your identification. Reservations can be faked, and we have a reputation to protect." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked the email with their confirmation. "Here it is. Reservation for Ethan Carter, 7:30 p.m. Take a good look." Clark barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head dismissively. "That proves nothing. I need to see ID. Both of you." Sophia's voice cracked with indignation. "We're paying customers, and you're treating us like criminals. This is unacceptable." Clark's tone sharpened. "If you have nothing to hide, then comply. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to leave." Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears as she whispered, Why are you doing this to us?" Clark's gaze hardened, her voice lowering but losing none of its venom. "Because people like you don't usually end up in places like this. I need to ensure everything is in order." Ethan rose from his seat abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The sound reverberated through the dining room, drawing more eyes toward them. His voice was low, but carried the weight of restrained anger. "You've crossed a line. We've complied with every rule, and you still choose to single us out. Enough." Clark tilted her head slightly, her expression daring. "Are you refusing to cooperate?" Ethan took a step forward, his tone unwavering. "I'm refusing to be bullied. You've shown no respect, no fairness, and no decency. If you have a legitimate issue, bring it up with the manager. Otherwise, leave us alone." A murmur rippled through the room. Nearby diners were openly watching now, some whispering, others recording the interaction on their phones. Clark ignored the growing audience and leaned in slightly, her voice a deliberate whisper. "You think you can intimidate me? This isn't about you being inconvenienced. It's about protecting the integrity of this establishment. Sophia stood, her hands trembling as she placed them flat on the table for support. You've made your bias clear. You don't want us here because we don't look like your usual guests. Just admit it. Clark straightened, her stance stiffening further. I suggest you both sit down and cooperate before this escalates. Ethan's voice cut through like a blade. The only person escalating this is you. We won't tolerate being treated like this any longer. Clark took a step back and motioned toward the security desk near the entrance. Two uniformed guards, both tall and broad, immediately began making their way toward the table. Sophia gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. You're calling security. For what? Sitting quietly and enjoying our dinner? Clark's response was cold and final. You've refused to cooperate. I'm simply ensuring that you're escorted out peacefully. Ethan's patience snapped. Escorted out? For what crime? Dining while black? Is that your justification? The room fell silent at his words, the tension so thick it seemed to suffocate the air. Even the guards paused briefly, glancing at each other uneasily before continuing their approach. Sophia's voice rose, her tears now freely streaming. This is beyond humiliating. You're ruining our evening for no reason other than your prejudice. The guards arrived at the table, their expressions stoic but hesitant. One of them, a younger man, glanced at Clark. What's the issue here? Clark's voice was icy. They're refusing to comply with standard verification procedures. Please remove them from the premises. The younger guard hesitated, his eyes shifting to Ethan and Sophia. They don't seem to be causing any trouble. Clark cut him off. I've already made my decision. Do your job. Ethan held up a hand, his voice commanding. You're not laying a hand on us. We have a right to be here, and we won't be intimidated into leaving. If you're so certain we don't belong, call the manager. Let them handle this. Sophia wiped her face, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Yes, call the manager. Let's see how they feel about losing loyal customers over your baseless accusations. Clark's jaw clenched, her authority clearly challenged. She turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the back of the dining room, barking orders into her radio. The guards stayed by the table, their unease evident. One of them muttered, We're just doing what we're told. Ethan's gaze burned with intensity. Then tell your boss to think twice before targeting people who've done nothing wrong. Sophia exhaled shakily, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. They won't get away with this, she whispered. Ethan nodded, his voice firm but quiet. No, they won't. As Clark disappeared to summon the manager, the atmosphere in the dining room grew heavier. Two burly security guards in crisp black uniforms approached Ethan and Sophia's table, their expressions devoid of warmth. The taller of the two spoke first, his voice flat and commanding. We've been asked to escort you out. Please leave immediately. Ethan remained seated, his gaze locked on the man. On what grounds? We've done nothing wrong, and we've already requested to speak with the manager. The shorter guard stepped closer, his hand reaching for Ethan's shoulder. You can explain it outside, sir. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Ethan batted the hand away, his voice steady but firm. Don't touch me. I'm asking for a manager, and I have every right to do so. Sophia, still seated, placed her hands flat on the table to steady herself. We are not leaving. Not until we get answers. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs of nearby diners. The taller guard sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, this isn't up for debate. Either you cooperate, or we'll have to remove you. Before Sophia could respond, the shorter guard reached down and gripped the back of her chair, attempting to pull it away from the table. Sophia clung to the armrests, her voice rising with indignation. Don't you dare! I'm not moving! Ethan was on his feet in an instant, stepping between the guard and Sophia. His frame blocked their view of her completely as he stared the man down. Get your hands off her. Now. The guard hesitated, momentarily thrown off by Ethan's unyielding stance. The tension in the room thickened, the low hum of whispered conversations growing louder as diners began to take out their phones, recording the unfolding drama. You're making this worse for yourselves, the taller guard said, his voice tinged with irritation. Just leave peacefully, and this doesn't have to escalate. Ethan's laugh was bitter, his frustration spilling over. You're the ones escalating it. We've asked for a manager, nothing more. Why is that so hard to understand? Sophia stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Is this how you treat all your customers, or just the ones who don't look like they belong? Her words cut through the room, drawing gasps from some onlookers. The shorter guard, visibly uncomfortable now, took a step back, glancing at his partner. This is getting out of hand, he muttered under his breath. But the taller guard wasn't backing down. We have our orders, he said firmly, looking directly at Ethan. Either you leave, or we'll have to call the authorities. Ethan's voice was razor sharp. Call them. I'd love to explain to the police how paying customers were manhandled and harassed in front of an entire room of witnesses. He gestured toward the diners, many of whom were still recording. The guards exchanged uneasy looks, the pressure of the growing audience clearly weighing on them. Clark reappeared then, her expression as rigid as ever. She took one look at the scene and barked an order. What's the delay? Remove them! Sophia's voice rang out, clear and defiant. We're not going anywhere until the manager gets here. If you're so certain you're in the right, let them decide. Clark's jaw tightened. But before she could respond, the sound of quick, determined footsteps interrupted her. A woman in her 40s, dressed in a tailored black suit, approached the table. Her face was tense, her eyes darting between the guards, Clark, and the couple. I'm Ellen Matthews, she announced, her voice steady but edged with urgency. I'm the manager here. What's going on? Clark opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan cut her off. Finally, we've been asking for you for the past 15 minutes. Your staff has been harassing us, and now your security is trying to throw us out without cause. Matthew's brows knit together as she looked at Clark. Rachel, what is this about? They don't belong here, Clark said flatly. Their behavior is disruptive, and I'm handling it. Sophia's eyes blazed as she turned to Matthews. Disruptive? We've been sitting here quietly, trying to enjoy our dinner, while she's been hounding us for no reason. Matthews held up a hand, silencing both sides. Let's calm down. I'll get to the bottom of this. She turned to Ethan. Sir, may I see your reservation details? Without hesitation, Ethan handed her his phone, the confirmation email still open. Matthews scanned it quickly, her face betraying a flicker of guilt. This reservation is valid, she said, her tone apologetic. Sophia folded her arms, her voice trembling with anger. Exactly. So why were we treated like this? Why did your security lay hands on us? Matthews looked at Clark, her expression hardening. Rachel, this is unacceptable. If their reservation is in order, there's no reason for this level of intervention. Clark's face darkened, her voice defensive. I was doing my job. I had reason to believe they weren't legitimate patrons. And what reason was that? Ethan demanded, his tone cutting. What about us made you so sure we didn't belong? Clark hesitated, but her silence spoke volumes. Matthews sighed deeply, turning back to Ethan and Sophia. I sincerely apologize for this. I assure you this isn't how we treat our guests. Sophia's laughter was bitter. But it is. You let it happen. The crowd around them began to murmur more audibly, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on everyone involved. Matthews straightened, addressing the guards. Stand down. Now. The guards stepped back, their postures stiff. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. An apology won't undo this. You've humiliated us in front of an entire room. What are you going to do to make this right? Matthews opened her mouth to respond, but the damage had already been done. As the tension in the room began to shift, Matthews realized this situation couldn't simply be smoothed over with words. The fallout had only just begun, and the couple wasn't about to let it slide. Ellen Matthews stood rigidly between Ethan, Sophia, and the tense group of security staff. Her gaze shifted to Clark, whose expression remained defiant, arms crossed as if she were daring anyone to question her actions. Rachel, explain what's going on here, Matthews demanded, her tone sharp but restrained. Clark straightened, her voice devoid of remorse. These two were acting suspiciously. I asked for identification to confirm their reservation, but they refused to comply. I was following protocol. Sophia's voice cut through the explanation like a knife. Protocol. Is it protocol to humiliate paying customers and accuse them without cause? Matthews raised a hand, motioning for silence. Let me handle this. She turned to Ethan. Mr. Carter, may I see your reservation confirmation? Ethan handed over his phone without hesitation. Matthews studied the email, scrolling carefully before looking back at him with an apologetic expression. This reservation is valid. There's no issue here. No issue? Sophia's voice was incredulous, her eyes narrowing. She called security to throw us out. You call that no issue? Matthews hesitated, then turned to Clark. If their reservation checks out, why did you escalate this? Clark's posture didn't waver. I had concerns about their legitimacy. I was trying to protect the restaurant's reputation. Ethan's temper flared, his voice rising. What about us made you question our legitimacy? We walked in, sat down, and followed every rule. What was so threatening about that? Clark's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't have to justify my instincts. Sophia let out a bitter laugh. Instincts? That's your excuse for profiling us? It's disgusting. Matthews shot Clark a warning look, then addressed Ethan and Sophia, her tone softening. I deeply regret how this situation has unfolded. On behalf of the restaurant, I want to extend my sincerest apologies. Ethan's eyes narrowed. An apology? That's it? Do you think a few empty words will fix this? Sophia's voice shook with restrained anger. We were publicly humiliated. People recorded us being treated like criminals in a room full of strangers. And you think a quick apology is enough? Matthews drew a deep breath, trying to maintain composure. I understand your frustration, and I assure you that this is not how we typically treat our guests. Not how you typically treat your guests, Ethan repeated, his tone icy. So what? Are we the exception? The ones who don't fit your mold? Clark interjected, her tone defensive. I was doing my job. I acted to ensure that this establishment remains a safe and exclusive space. Sophia turned on her voice sharp and unyielding. Exclusive? That's just a polite way of saying you didn't want us here. You saw two black people in your perfect little dining room, and you decided we didn't belong. Admit it. Clark's eyes flickered, but she remained silent, her jaw clenched. Matthews stepped forward, her voice rising slightly. Enough. Rachel, your actions here were uncalled for. I'll be addressing this later. You're taking their side? Clark snapped, incredulity flashing in her eyes. I was protecting the restaurant. Protecting it from what? Ethan demanded, stepping closer. From customers who saved up to celebrate a milestone. From people who dared to exist in your exclusive world. The room had gone eerily silent. Diners who had once been whispering now watched openly, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The weight of judgment in the room pressed down on Matthews, who rubbed her temples as if trying to stave off a brewing headache. We're handling this internally, Matthews said carefully, her voice firm. Rachel, step back. I'll take it from here. Clark hesitated, her face hardening as she shot Ethan and Sophia one last disdainful glance before moving a few paces away. Sophia wasn't finished. Handling it? That's all you're going to say. You let her treat us like second-class citizens, and you think you can just sweep this under the rug? Matthews exhaled sharply. You're right. This is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for what's happened tonight. Ethan folded his arms, his glare unrelenting. Responsibility without action is meaningless. What are you going to do about it? How will you make this right? Matthews faltered, her polished demeanor cracking slightly. We will investigate this matter thoroughly, and I'll ensure steps are taken to prevent this from happening again. Sophia leaned forward, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Thoroughly investigate? It happened right in front of you. You've already seen everything you need to see. Matthews flushed, clearly uncomfortable under their unyielding scrutiny. We're prepared to cover your bill for tonight's dinner and extend an invitation for you to return at a later date. On us. Sophia's laughter was bitter, tinged with disbelief. You think a free meal will erase what just happened? Ethan shook his head. This isn't about a meal. This is about dignity, about respect, and about the fact that your staff didn't just fail us. They targeted us. Matthews glanced at the diners around them, many of whom were still recording. She seemed torn, aware of the public relations nightmare unfolding before her. I can promise you this, she said finally, her voice low. This incident won't be ignored. I'll personally see to it that changes are made. Sophia crossed her arms. We'll see if that promise means anything. Ethan met Matthew's gaze, his voice steady and cutting. We're not letting this go. You'll hear from us again. Sophia sat on the couch with her laptop open, the screen casting a cold glow across her determined face. Ethan paced behind her, his fists clenched, his anger barely contained. We can't let this slide, Sophia said, her voice resolute. They need to be held accountable, not just for us, but for everyone they've treated this way. Ethan stopped mid-step and turned to her. You're right, but how do we make sure people listen? Sophia's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing. Each keystroke was deliberate, fueled by a mix of pain and resolve. She recounted the night in vivid detail. The stares, the whispers, the humiliation, and the blatant discrimination they had faced. Her words were raw, each sentence carrying the weight of their experience. We walked into Legrand excited to celebrate a milestone. Instead, we were treated like intruders, our presence questioned simply because we didn't fit their narrow idea of who belonged. We were humiliated in front of an entire room of strangers, all because of the color of our skin. As Sophia wrote, tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't about her pain. It was about shining a light on the injustice. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, reading quietly. That's perfect, he said finally. It's honest. People will feel it. Sophia nodded, her resolve hardening. She hit the post button and watched as the story went live on her social media accounts. Now we wait, she murmured, her hands trembling slightly. Within minutes, the first comments began rolling in. Friends, family, and acquaintances flooded the post with messages of support and outrage. This is unacceptable. How could they treat you like this? Legrand should be ashamed, but it didn't stop there. As the post gained traction, strangers began sharing it, tagging others, and calling for action. By the next morning, the story had gone viral. The hashtag, Nosh Justice for Ethan and Sophia, was trending across multiple platforms, with thousands of users expressing solidarity and sharing similar experiences of discrimination. Videos taken by other diners at Legrand began to surface, showing Ethan and Sophia's calm defiance and the escalating behavior of Officer Clark. The clips painted a damning picture. A security officer overstepping her bounds, a manager struggling to salvage the situation, and a couple being treated as if they were trespassers in a space they had every right to occupy. Sophia scrolled through the flood of messages on her phone, her emotions a whirlwind of gratitude and anger. Look at this, she said, showing Ethan a comment from a well-known activist. This isn't just about one couple, the post read. It's about a system that perpetuates exclusion and inequality. Legrand has a lot to answer for. Ethan set his coffee mug down with a thud. This is bigger than us now. They've ignited something they can't contain. As the story gained momentum, news outlets began picking it up. A local journalist reached out for an interview, eager to cover the incident that had captured the public's attention. Sophia and Ethan agreed, knowing it was an opportunity to amplify their voices. During the interview, Sophia spoke with unwavering conviction. We didn't just face bad service. We faced blatant racial profiling. No one should have to feel like they're being judged the moment they walk into a room simply because of who they are. Ethan added, this isn't just about one restaurant. It's about changing the culture that allows these things to happen over and over again. We're speaking out because silence only lets it continue. The interview aired later that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from viewers who empathized with their story and commended them for their courage. The public outcry put immense pressure on Legrand. The restaurant's official social media accounts were inundated with angry comments, demanding accountability. Apologize to Ethan and Sophia. We won't support a business that tolerates discrimination. Do better, Legrand. Facing mounting backlash, the restaurant released a statement late in the day. We deeply regret the incident that occurred and are committed to ensuring that all our guests feel welcome. We are reviewing the matter internally and will take appropriate action. The statement, vague and lacking specifics, only added fuel to the fire. Critics called it a weak attempt to save face without addressing the real issue. Sophia stared at the statement on her phone, her lips curling into a bitter smile. They think they can brush this under the rug. They're wrong. Ethan nodded, his voice steady. This isn't over. Not until they take real responsibility. Legrand's official social media account posted a statement late in the afternoon, an attempt to quell the growing outrage. We regret the unfortunate incident that occurred and apologize to any guests who may have felt unwelcome. Legrand is committed to inclusivity and ensuring every patron enjoys a five-star experience. We are currently reviewing the matter internally. Sophia read the statement aloud, her voice dripping with disbelief. No mention of Clark. No mention of what actually happened. Just vague corporate nonsense. Ethan's jaw tightened. They're hoping this blows over. They're not taking any real responsibility. The public saw through the empty words, too. The comments section of the post quickly exploded with backlash. Where's the accountability? Name the people responsible. An internal review means nothing without transparency. We're done with Legrand. Do better. A wave of hashtags surged anew. Justice for Ethan and Sophia. Boycott Legrand and not end racial profiling. Prominent figures joined the fray, amplifying the call for change. I stand with Ethan and Sophia, a well-known actor tweeted. This isn't just a bad experience, it's systemic racism. Hold Legrand accountable. A best-selling author chimed in. These stories happen far too often. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem in spaces designed to exclude. The restaurant's attempt to pacify the public backfired spectacularly. Boycott calls intensified, with customers canceling reservations en masse. Negative reviews flooded online platforms, reducing Legrand's once glowing rating to shambles. Amidst the chaos, whispers of dissent emerged from within the restaurant itself. A current server, emboldened by the viral backlash, reached out anonymously to a journalist covering the story. I've worked at Legrand for 3 years, the server revealed. Clark has a history of targeting certain guests, mostly people of color, under the guise of maintaining standards. Management has known about it, but never did anything because she's considered effective. Another former employee stepped forward, recounting her experience with discrimination during her time at the restaurant. It's not just how they treat guests. Staff who don't fit the image are overlooked or pushed out. I left because I couldn't stand it anymore. These revelations only fueled public anger. Sophia read the articles aloud to Ethan, her voice a mix of vindication and frustration. They knew, and they let it happen anyway. Ethan nodded grimly. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about a culture they've allowed to fester. Sophia opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she crafted another post. The problem with Legrand isn't just one rogue employee. It's a system that enables and protects people like Rachel Clark while silencing others. We demand real accountability, not just empty apologies. The post went viral within hours, reigniting the movement. Commenters praised Ethan and Sophia's courage while condemning the restaurant's lack of action. Meanwhile, inside Legrand, the pressure was mounting. Ellen Matthews, the manager, faced increasing scrutiny as calls flooded in from reporters demanding answers. In a tense staff meeting, Matthews addressed the growing crisis. This has gotten out of control, Matthews said, her voice tight. We need to take swift action to restore our reputation. One server raised their hand cautiously. Why don't we address what actually happened? Admit Clark was in the wrong and take real steps to fix things? Matthews hesitated, her gaze hardening. We can't throw our staff under the bus without a full investigation. This is about protecting the business. Another employee muttered under their breath. Protecting the business or protecting Clark? The tension in the room was palpable, mirroring the storm brewing outside the restaurant's walls. The breaking point came when a prominent civil rights organization publicly called for accountability. Legrand's vague response is unacceptable, their statement read. They must name those responsible, implement anti-bias training, and commit to real change. Words without action are meaningless. Ethan, watching the news coverage with Sophia, turned to her, his expression resolute. They're trying to play the long game, hoping people forget. We can't let that happen. Sophia agreed. It's time to take this to the next level. If they won't take responsibility willingly, we'll make. That evening, they contacted a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases. Sitting across the table from the lawyer, they recounted every detail of their experience, from the stares and whispers to Clark's relentless targeting and the manager's hollow apology. The attorney listened intently, nodding. You have a strong case. This isn't just a matter of bad service. It's a clear example of racial discrimination. We can file a lawsuit for emotional distress and reputational harm, and we can push for systemic reforms within the restaurant. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. Ethan placed a steady hand on hers. We're ready to fight, whatever it takes. Ethan and Sophia sat across from their attorney, Rebecca Hale, a seasoned civil rights lawyer with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. Rebecca leaned forward, her pen poised above a notepad. This is more than just a case of bad service, Rebecca began. What you experienced was systemic discrimination, plain and simple. We can prove that Legrand failed in their duty to provide equal treatment to all patrons. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. We don't want this swept under the rug. They need to be held accountable, publicly and legally. Rebecca glanced at Sophia. I agree. The question now is, what outcome are you looking for? Compensation? A public apology? Policy reform? Sophia's voice was steady, but her conviction was unmistakable. This isn't about the money. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. They need to change, from top to bottom. Rebecca smiled faintly. Then we'll push for a settlement that demands not only damages for the harm they caused you, but also mandatory anti-discrimination training, a review of their hiring practices, and public acknowledgement of their wrongdoing. Ethan exhaled. The lawsuit was filed the following week, citing racial discrimination, emotional distress, and reputational harm. The news broke quickly, making headlines in both local and national outlets. Couple files lawsuit against Legrand for racial discrimination. One headline read, High-end restaurant faces, legal action after viral incident, said another. Legrand's management responded swiftly, hiring a team of high-profile defense attorneys to combat the claims. Their lead lawyer, Martin Daniels, wasted no time issuing a statement to the press. The allegations against Legrand are baseless and exaggerated. The restaurant has always maintained the highest standards of inclusivity and professionalism. We intend to vigorously defend our reputation against these unfounded accusations. Sophia read the statement aloud, her hands shaking with anger. Unfounded. They're doubling down on their lies. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. They're scared, Sophia. They know they're in the wrong, but admitting it would destroy. Rebecca reassured them. This is a standard tactic. Deny, deflect, and drag it out. But we have evidence. The videos, the witness statements, the accounts from their former employees, all of it paints a clear picture. The legal battle began in earnest, with both sides exchanging documents and preparing for depositions. During one tense meeting, Rebecca presented damning evidence to Daniels and his team. Video footage of Officer Clark's actions that night. Testimonies from former employees who had witnessed or experienced similar discrimination. Data showing a clear pattern of targeting minority patrons over several years. Daniels attempted to dismiss the evidence. This doesn't prove systemic issues. At best, it shows isolated incidents. Rebecca's response was razor-sharp. When you have dozens of isolated incidents, it's no longer isolated. It's a pattern, and we will prove it in. Meanwhile, the public discourse surrounding the case intensified. Activists and community leaders rallied behind Ethan and Sophia, calling for broader conversations about racism in luxury spaces. Social media lit up with hashtags like racism in fine dining and accountability. Now, the pressure began to take a toll on Legrand. Bookings plummeted, and several high-profile clients publicly canceled their reservations. A celebrity chef even condemned the restaurant, stating, "True luxury is inclusion, not exclusion." Ethan and Sophia's depositions were grueling. Daniels's team attempted to paint them as overly sensitive, suggesting they had misinterpreted the events. "Mr. Carter," Daniels said during the deposition, "is it possible that Officer Clark was simply performing her duties and that you took her actions personally?" Ethan's eyes narrowed. "No, her actions weren't about her duties. They were about her bias. She didn't question anyone else in that dining room, just us." Sophia was equally unyielding. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was clear from the moment we walked in that we were being judged, not for what we did, but for who we are." Rebecca commended them after. "You handled that perfectly. They'll keep trying to shift blame, but the evidence is on our side." As the case progressed, Daniels proposed a settlement, a confidential payout in exchange for dropping the law. Rebecca relayed the offer to Ethan and Sophia, but their reaction was immediate. "We're not taking it," Ethan said firmly. Sophia nodded. "If we settle quietly, nothing will change. They'll go right back to their old ways." Rebecca agreed. "Then we move forward. They'll regret underestimating." The case continued to dominate headlines, sparking debates about racism in elite spaces and the broader issue of systemic discrimination. Talk shows invited experts to weigh in, and online forums buzzed with conversations about accountability in industries built on exclusivity. Legrand's leadership tried to salvage their reputation, announcing initiatives like diversity training and community outreach programs. But the gestures were seen as too little, too late. Sophia wasn't impressed. "They're scrambling to save face, not to make real change." Ethan added, "We're going to make sure they..." As the trial date loomed, the case became a symbol of the fight against exclusionary practices in high-end industries, with Ethan and Sophia determined to see it through to the end. As Ethan and Sophia's lawsuit gained traction, their story became a rallying cry for change. Civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, recognizing the case as an opportunity to address the broader issue of systemic discrimination in luxury space. The National Equity Alliance, NEA, a prominent civil rights group, reached out to Ethan and Sophia to partner on a series of events. The couple agreed, understanding that their fight was now bigger than just. At the first panel discussion, held in a packed community center, NEA representatives highlighted the pervasive nature of exclusion in high-end industry. Ethan and Sophia sat among the speakers, sharing their story with an audience that included journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to listen. "It's not just about what happened to us," Ethan said, gripping the microphone tightly. "It's about a system that makes people like us feel out of place, no matter how hard we work or how much we achieve." Sophia added, "We're here to say enough is enough. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter where they are or who they are." Their words resonated, sparking applause and igniting discussions across social media platforms. Clips from the panel went viral, with hashtags like "Josh Justice for Ethan and Sophia" and "Josh Inclusion Matters" trending worldwide. Activists and influencers organized a coordinated campaign to demand accountability and systemic reform in the restaurant industry. The movement, branded as "Start End Exclusion," urged businesses to adopt anti-discrimination policies and provide mandatory training for staff. The campaign included petitions. Online petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, calling for industry-wide changes. Video campaigns. Personal testimonies from individuals who had faced discrimination in upscale spaces flooded platforms like Instagram and TikTok, adding fuel to the fire. Corporate pressure. Activists demanded transparency from high-end establishments, urging them to release reports on diversity and inclusion practices. Sophia and Ethan actively participated, sharing their story on live streams and interviews. "We're fighting for more than justice in our case," Sophia said during one session. "We're fighting for a world where no one has to justify their presence." The momentum of the movement began to shake the foundations of industries built on exclusivity. Several luxury restaurants and hotels faced renewed scrutiny, with customers questioning their commitment to fairness. Some establishments voluntarily released statements affirming their dedication to inclusivity, while others scrambled to implement diversity training to avoid public shaming. Legrand, however, remained defiant, issuing a second vague apology that further enraged the public. "We've already addressed this matter and are committed to learning from the experience," they stated. Sophia reacted to the post during a live broadcast. "Learning? What have they learned if they won't even admit what happened? This isn't learning, it's hiding." Ethan chimed in, his tone sharp. "They're hoping the noise dies down, but it won't. Not this." The momentum inspired other organizations to join the fight. The Restaurant Workers Advocacy Group, RWAG, launched a comprehensive report on discrimination in the hospitality industry, highlighting patterns of bias similar to what Ethan and Sophia experienced. "We've been complicit for too long," the report stated. "It's time to dismantle the elitism and racism baked into the foundations of this industry." Ethan and Sophia were invited to speak at the report's release event. Sophia's voice was steady but fierce as she addressed the crowd. "It's not enough to expose the problem. We need solutions, mandatory training, accountability for staff, and policies that ensure these spaces are accessible to everyone. The audience erupted in applause, their support emboldening the couple. The movement caught the attention of celebrities and public figures, many of whom used their platforms to amplify the message. A-list actors, musicians, and athletes posted messages of support, tagging Legrand and demanding action. One actor's tweet read, "I've dined at Legrand. It's a beautiful space. But no space is beautiful when built on exclusion. Do better." Late-night talk show hosts discussed the case, turning it into a national conversation. One host remarked, "You know what's fancier than a $300 steak? Respect. It costs nothing and makes everyone feel welcome." The coverage further embarrassed Legrand, whose reputation was now in free fall. Amid the rising tide, Ethan and Sophia emerged as symbols of resilience and justice. They were invited to sit on panels, appear in interviews, and lend their voices to broader discussions about inequality. A particularly powerful moment came during a town hall meeting hosted by NE. Ethan addressed the crowd, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about changing policies, it's about changing mindsets. The belief that some people belong more than others is at the root of this issue, and we need to confront it head-on." Sophia added, "We can't dismantle centuries of exclusion overnight, but every conversation, every action brings us closer. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Restaurants and hotels began adopting reforms as the movement gained traction. Some partnered with advocacy groups to implement anti-bias training, while others issued public acknowledgments of past mistakes. A few establishments even reached out to Sophia and Ethan, inviting them to help shape new policies. While the couple welcomed the progress, they remained critical of efforts that felt performative. "Change is good," Ethan said in an interview, "but it needs to be authentic. It can't just be about saving face. It has to come from a place of genuine commitment to equality." The public pressure on Legrand became impossible to ignore. As calls for accountability reached a crescendo, the restaurant released a terse statement announcing that Rachel Clark, the security officer at the center of the controversy, had been terminated. "Legrand does not tolerate behavior inconsistent with our commitment to inclusivity," the statement read. "We are implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff to prevent future incidents." Sophia read the announcement on her phone, her brow furrowing. Firing her doesn't fix the system. It's a start, but it's not an... Ethan agreed. "They're trying to put a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound. Let's see if they follow through with real change." The restaurant's manager, Ellen Matthews, broke her silence shortly after. In a live-streamed press conference, she addressed the incident directly, her demeanor a mix of contrition and professionalism. "First, I want to sincerely apologize to Mr. Carter and Ms. Johnson for the unacceptable treatment they received at our establishment," Matthews began. "What happened that night does not reflect the values we strive to uphold at Legrand. We failed them, and for that, I take full responsibility." She paused, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of flashing cameras and a room full of reporters. "We are committed to making this right. We've begun working with civil rights organizations to implement meaningful reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, from management to entry-level employees. This will not happen." Sophia watched the press conference with a skeptical eye. "Words are easy. Let's see if they match it with action." Ethan, seated beside her, added, "At least they're acknowledging their failure. That's more than they did." The case proceeded to court, despite Legrand's attempts to settle out of the public eye. The trial was swift but intense, with Rebecca Hale, Ethan and Sophia's lawyer, presenting a powerful argument. In her closing statement, Rebecca addressed the jury. "This case is not about a single night or a single couple. It's about a pattern of exclusion and the need for accountability. If we allow businesses to act with impunity, we're sending a message that discrimination is acceptable. It's time to draw a line." Legrand's defense attempted to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, arguing that Clark's actions were an isolated lapse in judgment. But video evidence, witness testimonies, and the testimonies of former employees painted a damning picture of a culture that prioritized exclusivity over fairness. After deliberation, the jury found in favor of Ethan and Sophia, awarding them significant damages for emotional distress and reputational harm. The court also mandated that Legrand implement its promised reforms under the supervision of a third-party organization to ensure compliance. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as Ethan and Sophia emerged victorious. Ethan addressed the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just our victory. It's a victory for everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong," he said. "We didn't fight for money or recognition. We fought for accountability and change, and we're proud to see justice." Sophia added, "We're donating the settlement to civil rights organizations working to dismantle systemic discrimination. This fight isn't over, but today is a step forward." Following the court's decision, Legrand underwent a series of highly publicized reforms. A third-party consulting firm was hired to oversee the implementation of anti-bias training, and the restaurant's hiring and promotion practices were reviewed to ensure greater diversity. Several months later, the NEA released a report on Legrand's progress. While there is still work to be done, the steps taken by Legrand demonstrate that meaningful change is possible when businesses are held accountable, the report concluded. Sophia and Ethan, though satisfied with the outcome, remained vigilant. They continued working with advocacy groups, using their platform to push for broader change across the industry. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Sophia said during a panel discussion. "But if we keep demanding it, we'll get." Ethan, "This case showed that no one is untouchable. Every business, every industry needs to look in the mirror and ask, are we truly inclusive or are we just pretending?" Months after their court victory, Ethan and Sophia found themselves in a packed auditorium, the stage lights shining brightly on them. They were no longer just a couple who had experienced injustice. They were now prominent voices in the fight for equality. Sophia stepped forward, gripping the podium as she addressed the audience. "When we walked into Legrand that night, we didn't expect to become symbols of a larger fight. We just wanted to celebrate a milestone. But when we were made to feel like outsiders, like we didn't belong, we realized we couldn't stay." Ethan took the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "Our journey since that night hasn't been easy. The emotional toll, the public scrutiny, it's been a lot. But we knew that this was bigger than us. It was about challenging a system that's been allowed to exclude, dismiss, and devalue people for far too long." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy invigorating the couple. Following the trial, Ethan and Sophia dedicated themselves to advocacy. They collaborated with civil rights organizations, using their experience to push for legislative reforms. Their focus wasn't just on the restaurant industry, but on all spaces where systemic bias thrived. Sophia penned a memoir, Uninvited, Fighting for Belonging in a Divided World, which became a bestseller. In the book, she recounted their experience, but more importantly, she highlighted the stories of others who had faced similar struggles. "This book isn't just about what happened to us," she explained during a televised interview. "It's about giving a voice to the voiceless. Too often, these stories are dismissed or ignored. We wanted to make sure they were." Ethan, leveraging his platform as a successful entrepreneur, launched an initiative aimed at fostering diversity in luxury industries. Partnering with advocacy groups, he organized training programs and mentorship opportunities for underrepresented communities. "We're not just fixing what's broken," he said during the launch event. "We're building something better, something where everyone can belong." Despite their public success, the emotional scars of their experience lingered. Sophia occasionally found herself replaying the events of that night, the humiliation and anger bubbling to the surface. Ethan struggled with moments of self-doubt, questioning whether their fight would truly make a difference. But they leaned on each other for. During one particularly difficult evening, Sophia turned to Ethan and said, "It would have been easier to walk away, but every step we've taken since then has been worth it. Look at what we've accomplished." Ethan, "We've turned something painful into something powerful. That's what." Their efforts sparked broader change. Other victims of discrimination came forward, inspired by Ethan and Sophia's courage. Several businesses proactively implemented anti-bias policies, aiming to avoid similar controversies. A prominent restaurateur publicly credited Ethan and Sophia for his decision to overhaul hiring practices in his establishments. "Their fight opened my eyes," he admitted. "We can't keep pretending these issues don't exist." At a national diversity summit, Sophia addressed a crowd of leaders from various industries. Change isn't just about policies, she said passionately. It's about confronting our own biases, listening to the people we've ignored, and being willing to get uncomfortable. That's the only way. On the anniversary of the incident at LeGrand, Ethan and Sophia hosted a community event titled Belonging. The event featured panels, workshops, and discussions aimed at fostering inclusion in every aspect of society. As the day drew to a close, Ethan and Sophia took the stage together. The crowd quieted as Sophia began to. When we started this journey, we didn't know where it would lead, she said. We just knew we couldn't stay silent. And now looking at all of you, we see the power of what happens when we stand together. Ethan. No one should ever feel like they don't belong, not because of their skin color, their background, or any part of who they are. The fight for equality isn't just about changing systems, it's about changing hearts. Sophia's final words echoed through the room. No one should ever feel like they don't belong anywhere because of the color of their skin. Together, we can build a world where everyone is. The crowd rose to their feet, the applause thunderous and unrelenting. Ethan and Sophia stood side by side, their hands clasped, looking out at the faces before them. They had turned their pain into purpose, their fight into a. Ethan and Sophia's journey reminds us all that change begins with courage and the determination to speak up, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Their story isn't just about justice for two individuals, it's about challenging a system that has excluded so many for far too long. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. What do you think needs to happen to ensure spaces like LeGrand are truly inclusive for everyone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire change and ignite action. Together, we can create a world where everyone belongs.
The morning sun filtered through the sprawling oaks lining Riverside Estates, casting a golden glow over the pristine neighborhood. It was the kind of place where lawns were perfectly manicured, SUVs gleamed in driveways, and porch flags proclaimed allegiance to both the American dream and an unspoken exclusivity. Officer Bradley Cooper adjusted his sunglasses, gripping the steering wheel of his patrol car as he scanned the streets. Quiet as a church, just how I like it, Bradley muttered, the slight southern twang in his voice giving his words a sharper edge. Next to him, Officer Ethan Miller stared out the window, his expression uneasy. Ethan was new, fresh out of the academy, with a badge that still shone too brightly. His training officer, Bradley, was a department legend in Charleston's Riverside precinct, though not always for the right reasons. "Don't let the silence fool you," Bradley said, breaking the quiet. "These types of neighborhoods, full of snakes in suits, sneaking around, thinking they can outsmart the law. You see something out of place, you call it out." "Got it." Ethan nodded but stayed quiet, hoping the day would pass without incident. As they rounded the corner, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the driveway of a modern glass-front home. The man stepping out of the car caught Bradley's attention immediately. Tall, black, wearing a tailored gray suit that fit him like a second skin. He moved with an effortless confidence, holding a leather briefcase in one hand. Bradley narrowed his eyes. "Now, tell me that doesn't look suspicious." Ethan hesitated. "I mean, it's just a guy parking in his driveway. Maybe he—" "No, maybe, rookie," Bradley interrupted, slowing the car to a crawl. "Trust me, this doesn't sit right. Let's check it out." The patrol car came to a stop, and Bradley stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached the man. Ethan reluctantly followed, feeling the weight of dread settling in his stomach. The man, now halfway to the front door, turned to face them. His expression was calm, his brows slightly furrowed, as if he already knew what was coming. "Good morning, officers," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Morning," Bradley replied curtly. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man raised an eyebrow, glancing at the car and then back at Bradley. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem?" "Just answering a question would be a good start," Bradley shot back, his hand resting on his holster. Do you live here? The man sighed quietly and shook his head. No, I'm here for a meeting with the homeowner. He reached into his pocket slowly and retrieved a set of keys, holding them up. These were left for me in the mailbox. I was given permission to enter. Ethan cleared his throat. Maybe you should let me handle this, Bradley snapped, silencing his partner. Got ID on you? Bradley asked, his voice sharp. The man nodded and pulled out his wallet. Here you go, Nathaniel Brooks. You'll see everything's in order. Bradley snatched the ID, holding it up to the sunlight as if he were inspecting a counterfeit bill. HM, fancy name, fancy suit, fancy car. That's a lot of fancy for someone just visiting. You sure this isn't your way of casing the joint? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his composure didn't break. I assure you, officer, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That's so, Bradley said, his tone dripping with disbelief. Well, how about you prove it? Registration for the car? Meeting details? Or do we just skip to the part where you come down to the station? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Bradley, maybe we should. Rookie, zip it, Bradley barked, turning his full attention back to Nathaniel. Here's the deal. We've got a nice neighborhood here, and your story just doesn't sit right with me. So, how about you stop with the attitude and cooperate? Nathaniel straightened, his calm voice now tinged with steel. Officer, I've been nothing but cooperative. What you're doing is profiling. Plain and simple. Bradley's face darkened. Profiling? That's a big word for someone about to ride in the back of a squad car. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Ethan stepped forward. Bradley, come on, this isn't. Step back, Miller. Bradley barked. Nathaniel didn't resist as Bradley slapped the cuffs on him, though the humiliation was written all over his face. The crisp white of his shirt contrasted sharply with the cold metal around his wrists. This is absurd, Nathaniel said, his voice still calm but laced with frustration. I have the keys. I've given you identification. There's nothing here to justify this. Tell it to the judge, Bradley sneered, gripping Nathaniel's arm and leading him to the patrol car. Ethan, helpless, climbed back into the passenger seat. The silence during the drive to the station was suffocating. Bradley whistled as if it were just another routine day. At the Riverside Police Precinct, the humiliation only worsened. Nathaniel was processed like any other suspect. Mugshot taken, pockets emptied, and his personal belongings cataloged. The officers on duty exchanged smirks as they watched. Got ourselves a real Wall Street type, one officer said, eyeing Nathaniel's briefcase. Tom Jenkins, a loud and abrasive officer known for his crass humor, chuckled as he examined Nathaniel's suit. This guy came dressed to impress. What did you think? You were heading to a job interview. Hate to break it to you, pal, but orange is your color now. Nathaniel met Tom's gaze, his expression unwavering. I suggest you tread carefully, officer. You're out of your depth. Tom laughed, slapping his knee. Oh, he's got jokes. Look at this one, Bradley. Bradley joined in, smirking. Yeah, he thinks he's somebody important. Well, we'll see about that once we run his name. Meanwhile, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the confiscated items laid out before him. Among them was a sleek leather wallet containing a gold embossed card. His curiosity got the better of him, and he flipped it over. Nathaniel Brooks, Chief of Police, South Carolina State Police. Ethan's blood ran cold. His heart raced as he checked the name against the database. There it was, clear as day. Nathaniel Brooks was indeed the newly appointed Chief of Police for the state. Swallowing hard, Ethan rushed to Bradley, holding up the card. Bradley, we messed up. Big time. Bradley took the card, glanced at it, and laughed. Oh, come on. You think this guy is a state chief of police? What? He printed this at Kinko's. Bradley, it's in the system, Ethan insisted. He's legit. We arrested the chief of police. Bradley's smirk faltered. No, no way. As the realization began to dawn on the precinct, the laughter stopped. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Martha Reynolds, the precinct's senior sergeant, stormed into the room, keys jangling in her hand. "Where is he?" she demanded. "In the cell," Ethan said, his voice trembling. Martha marched to the holding area and unlocked the door. Nathaniel stepped out, his suit wrinkled but his dignity intact. His eyes swept over the room, landing on each officer who had mocked him. The silence was deafening as Nathaniel straightened his tie and said in a calm, cutting voice, "Gentlemen, you've just made the mistake of your careers." The room felt like it had been vacuum sealed. Every officer frozen in place as the realization of their mistake settled over them. Nathaniel Brooks stood at the center of it all, a calm but commanding presence. His suit, once immaculate, now bore the faint creases of the holding cell. Yet he still managed to exude authority. Martha Reynolds, visibly shaken, had positioned herself between Nathaniel and the other officers, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She knew damage control was a futile effort at this point, but she had to try. "Chief Brooks," she began, her voice faltering. I deeply regret." "Stop," Nathaniel said, raising a hand. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire room. "Save your apologies, Sergeant Reynolds. They're not for me. They're for the badge you all wear." The officers who had been mocking him minutes earlier now avoided his gaze, their faces red with embarrassment. Bradley stood near the doorway, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw set in defiance. He didn't look humiliated, he looked angry. Nathaniel took a step forward, addressing the room as a whole. "You think I don't know what's happening here? That I haven't seen this play out 100 times before? A black man in a nice car, wearing a nice suit, and suddenly he doesn't belong. Suddenly he's a criminal." Ethan, seated at his desk, felt his chest tighten. The weight of Nathaniel's words was unbearable because they were true. He hadn't stopped Bradley. He hadn't done anything to prevent this disaster. Nathaniel turned his sharp gaze to Bradley, who still hadn't moved. "Officer Cooper, isn't it? I'd like to hear your explanation. What was it about me that made you so sure I was guilty? Was it the suit? The car? Or just the fact that I didn't match your idea of who belongs in that neighborhood?" Bradley didn't flinch. "I did my job, sir. That's all there is to it. If you hadn't acted suspicious..." "Suspicious?" Nathaniel interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut through the room like a knife. "Walking to a front door with keys in my hand is suspicious to you? Carrying identification and cooperating with every one of your ridiculous demands is suspicious." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Nathaniel wasn't done. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Officer Cooper? I see a man who hides his prejudice behind his badge. You don't enforce the law, you enforce your bias. And today, you decided to humiliate the wrong person." Bradley's face darkened, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nathaniel turned to Martha. "Sergeant, I want a meeting with every officer in this precinct. Now." Martha nodded quickly, already moving to gather the staff. "Yes, Chief Brooks. Right away." The precinct's conference room was a small, outdated space with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that rarely worked. But now, it was packed wall to wall with officers, every one of them looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. Bradley sat at the back, his arms still crossed, while Ethan hovered near the door, unsure whether he should even be in the room. Nathaniel stood at the front, hands resting on the table. His calm demeanor had returned, but the edge in his voice hadn't softened. "Let me make one thing clear," he began, scanning the room. "I didn't come here to be humiliated. I came here to do my job, a job I've worked damn hard to earn. And what did I get in return? Cuffs on my wrists and racist jokes at my expense." Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. Nathaniel continued, his voice growing stronger. "What happened today isn't about me. This is bigger than me. This is about the culture that allows officers like Cooper to assume guilt based on nothing more than skin color. It's about the rest of you standing by, laughing, instead of speaking up. And it's about a system that protects bad cops instead of holding them accountable. He turned his attention to Ethan, who flinched under his gaze. And then there's you, the rookie. You saw what was happening, didn't you? You knew it wasn't right. Ethan swallowed hard. I tried to say something, but I didn't. You didn't try hard enough. Nathaniel cut in, his tone unforgiving. Do you know what's worse than an officer like Cooper? An officer who knows better but stays silent. Ethan's face burned with shame. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his anger simmering into something colder and more deliberate. I've seen this system from every angle. I've been stopped, searched, and humiliated more times than I can count. And I know that what happened to me today happens to black men and women across this country every single day. People without badges, without titles, without the privilege of being able to expose it the way I can. Bradley finally spoke up, his voice full of disdain. Look, with all due respect, Chief, you're blowing this out of proportion. We're just doing our jobs. If you've got a problem with how I handle mine, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The room went dead silent. All eyes turned to Nathaniel, who stared at Bradley for a long moment before speaking. You're right about one thing, Cooper, he said evenly. I do have a problem with how you handle your job, and I can promise you that problem is going to be addressed. But let me be perfectly clear. You're the one who doesn't belong here. You don't belong in a system that's supposed to serve and protect everyone, not just the people you deem worthy. Bradley smirked, leaning back in his chair. We'll see about that. Nathaniel didn't react. Instead, he turned to Martha. Sergeant Reynolds, I want a full review of today's incident. Every action, every word, every officer involved. And I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. Martha nodded stiffly. Understood, Chief. Nathaniel's gaze swept over the room one last time. To the rest of you, if you think this is just another incident that's going to get swept under the rug, think again. Change is coming to this precinct, to this department, and I suggest you decide now whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ethan found himself lingering in the hallway after the meeting, his mind racing. He felt torn between the ideals that had led him to join the force and the reality he'd witnessed today. Nathaniel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Miller. Ethan turned to see Nathaniel standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Sir, Ethan stammered, unsure of what to say. Nathaniel studied him for a moment before speaking. You have potential, Miller, but potential means nothing without courage. Remember that? Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Yes, sir. Nathaniel gave him a final, piercing look before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Back in the squad room, Bradley was already venting to Tom. He thinks he can come in here and lecture us like we're kids. Screw that. I've been on this job 20 years. I'm not taking orders from someone who doesn't even know how we do things here. Tom chuckled, slapping Bradley on the back. Don't sweat it. Guys like that, they make a lot of noise, but they don't last long. You'll see. But as Bradley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time he might have underestimated the fight ahead. The morning after Nathaniel Brooks's forced detainment, the entire precinct felt like it was holding its breath. The news had already spread like wildfire, not only within the department, but across the entire city of Charleston. By 9 a.m., the local news was running the story. New state police chief arrested by his own officers. Allegations of racial profiling surface. Nathaniel's face, stoic and composed as always, was plastered across the front page of every major news outlet in the area. Social media buzzed with outrage, both from supporters and critics. Back at the Riverside precinct, things were quieter than usual. Officers shuffled through their duties, their movements mechanical. Tension hung in the air like smoke and no one dared to speak out of turn. Even the usual banter between officers felt forced and strained. The gravity of what had happened the day before lingered like a shadow over everyone in the building. Bradley Cooper sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the surface as he stared at the computer screen. The familiar rhythm of his daily routine had been shattered. He had seen the headlines. He knew what the public was thinking. He had been here for 2 decades, long enough to understand how quickly things could spiral out of control. And this was spiraling. Bradley had always believed that the system, the badge, and the authority it carried had a certain unquestionable power. But Nathaniel's calm, calculated rebuke the day before it had shaken him to the core. The sting of being exposed in front of his peers still burned in his chest. Ethan Miller, on the other hand, was struggling with an entirely different set of questions. He had spent the entire night replaying the events over and over in his mind. Could he have done more when he saw Nathaniel being treated like a criminal? Should he have stood up to Bradley, even if it meant defying his mentor? Was he complicit simply because he stayed silent? The young officer had no answers, only a gnawing feeling that he was part of the very system he had sworn to protect. It was in this quiet, tense atmosphere that Nathaniel entered the precinct later that morning. His presence alone seemed to change the energy in the room. He didn't walk into the building with the same loud authority that some might expect from a man in his position. Instead, he was composed, almost somber, as if he had a purpose far beyond the one anyone else could see. The officers who were present at the arrest the previous day, Bradley, Tom Jenkins, and several others, shifted uncomfortably as Nathaniel approached the front desk. His voice was calm, but the weight of it reverberated through the room. "I need to speak with everyone involved in yesterday's incident." Immediately, Bradley stood up quickly, his palms pressed flat against the desk. "You've made your point, Chief. There's no need for this." Nathaniel turned to him slowly, his eyes cold, but there was no anger in his gaze. There was only the promise of something far more dangerous: accountability. "I'm not here to argue, Officer Cooper," Nathaniel said softly. "I'm here to do my job." With that, he moved toward the conference room, signaling for Bradley, Tom, and the others to follow. The tension that followed in the hallways was palpable, as if everyone knew that the next few minutes would decide the course of the department's future. The conference room was stiflingly quiet as the officers filed in one by one. Ethan took a seat in the back, his gaze drifting to the floor. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone, especially not Bradley. He was still trying to reconcile the mentor he had admired with the man who had made a mockery of the badge he wore. Once everyone was seated, Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his posture straight and unwavering. He looked each officer in the eye before speaking, his words measured but firm. What happened yesterday wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a deeper issue that has been allowed to fester for too long. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in. "You see, I don't care about your intentions, Cooper. I care about the impact of your actions." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Nathaniel held up a hand to silence him. "You had every opportunity to do things right, every opportunity to approach me with professionalism, but instead, you chose to treat me as a threat. Why? Because I didn't fit the mold you're so comfortable with? Because I wasn't white, wealthy, or, God forbid, one of you?" Ethan could feel the heat rising in his chest, the guilt gnawing at him again. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. "The truth is, this happens all over the country. Black men and women are treated as criminals before they even open their mouths. And what's worse, it happens within the very institution that's supposed to protect them. The irony isn't lost on me, but I'm not here for irony. I'm here to make sure this never happens again." Bradley's face tightened. "We were just doing our job. There was nothing racial about it." Nathaniel's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. "You think you weren't being racist? You think you can treat a man like that, based on the color of his skin and the car he drives, and not be part of the problem?" A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. "I'm not here to get into semantics," Nathaniel continued. I'm here to change the culture, and if you're not willing to change, then you can leave. Today, the room was dead silent. Nathaniel's gaze swept over every officer present, the weight of his words pressing down like an anchor. The tension was suffocating, and for the first time, Bradley looked uncertain. You can start by telling me the truth, Cooper. You're going to sit here and tell me you didn't know what you were doing? That you didn't know you were wrong? Nathaniel's voice was quiet but unyielding. Bradley swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he looked away, the guilt creeping in like a shadow. Tom Jenkins, ever the opportunist, cleared his throat. Look, Chief, we didn't mean to cross any lines. It was just a mistake. We've all made mistakes. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had seen the same excuse too many times. Mistakes, he repeated. You call racial profiling a mistake? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the reckoning he had been waiting for. Nathaniel was taking them to task, calling out everything that had been left unspoken for far too long. This isn't just about a single incident, Nathaniel said, his tone growing colder. This is about a system that has allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. A system that tells people like me we don't belong. A few officers shuffled in their seats, the weight of his words sinking in. Nathaniel wasn't speaking just to Bradley anymore. He was speaking to all of them. I'll be conducting a full review of this department. Every officer will undergo bias training, and those who are unwilling to confront their own prejudices will find themselves out of a job. I don't care who they are. Bradley's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the room was too heavy with Nathaniel's resolve. His words hung in the air like a sentence, one that couldn't be ignored. Finally, Nathaniel addressed the room one last time. This is your last chance. You either stand with me in making this department better, or you stand against it. And if you choose the latter, don't expect me to turn a blind eye. As Nathaniel turned to leave, there was no cheering, no fanfare, just a quiet, unsettling realization that this was only the beginning. The precinct was a simmering pressure cooker in the days following Nathaniel Brooks's intervention. The silence that had settled after his speech was replaced by murmurs in the hallways, whispered conversations behind closed doors, and nervous glances exchanged between officers who suddenly felt exposed. The weight of his promise, that things would change and swiftly, hung over everyone. Bradley Cooper had retreated into a corner of the break room, where he sat nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His usual bravado had dulled. It wasn't just the humiliation of being called out by Nathaniel in front of his peers. It was a growing realization that his actions had brought unwanted scrutiny to the department. He could feel it everywhere, in the awkward avoidance of his colleagues, the cautious tone of their conversations, and the sudden absence of Tom Jenkins, who had taken sick leave to avoid the fallout. Ethan Miller walked past the break room and paused, hesitating. He hadn't spoken to Bradley since the day of Nathaniel's arrest. Part of him didn't want to. He felt sickened by the way Bradley had handled the situation. But another part of him, still clinging to his rookie instincts, wanted to understand. Ethan stepped inside, clearing his throat. Officer Cooper. Bradley glanced up, his expression guarded. What do you want, rookie? Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but he pressed on. I want to ask, do you think what we did was right? Bradley leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. You're still green, kid. You don't get it yet. Right or wrong doesn't matter when you're out there. What matters is control. You lose control of a situation. You lose everything. That wasn't control, Ethan said, his voice firmer than he expected. That was harassment. We treated him like a criminal when we had no reason to. And now the whole department is under fire because of it. Bradley's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. Watch yourself, Miller. You think you're above this? You're just as much a part of the system as I am. Don't act like you're clean when you didn't say a damn word to stop it. Ethan flinched at the accusation, But Bradley wasn't wrong. The shame was a constant weight on his shoulders. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing voice in his head telling him that something had to change. "You're right," Ethan admitted quietly. "I should have spoken up. I didn't, and I regret it. But you didn't even question yourself, did you? You just assumed he didn't belong." Bradley's face hardened. "Get out, Miller." Ethan stared at him for a moment longer before turning and leaving the room. He didn't know what he had expected, a confession? A moment of reflection? Whatever it was, it hadn't come. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Brooks was in his temporary office on the second floor, reviewing the department's personnel files. The deeper he dug, the more frustrated he became. Complaints of misconduct, ranging from excessive force to discriminatory behavior, were buried under mountains of bureaucracy. Officers like Bradley and Tom had multiple infractions on their records, but none of them had led to meaningful consequences. Martha Reynolds entered the room, carrying a folder under her arm. "Chief Brooks," she said, her tone professional but tinged with unease. "I thought you want to see this." Nathaniel gestured for her to sit. She placed a folder on the desk and opened it, revealing documents related to Bradley Cooper's tenure. "I've been going through his record," Martha said. "He's been with us for nearly 20 years. Most of it's clean on the surface, but if you look closer..." Nathaniel scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing as he read. Bradley had been involved in multiple incidents that raised red flags: unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior during routine patrols, and even a formal complaint of racial bias from a black resident 5 years earlier. The complaint had been dismissed, labeled as unsubstantiated. "This isn't just a one-off issue," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with anger. "It's a pattern, and the department let it slide." Martha nodded, though her expression betrayed her discomfort. "Chief, I need to be honest. I've worked with Bradley for years. He's not a bad cop, but he's stubborn. He thinks he knows what's best, and sometimes that blinds him. But I also know he's not going to change unless he's forced to." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Then it's time we force him. The question is, how far do we push?" Martha hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "We start by holding him accountable, and then we use this as a case study to overhaul the entire precinct." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel called a second meeting, this time with a smaller group. The officers most directly involved in the arrest, including Bradley, Ethan, and Martha. The atmosphere was tense as they gathered in the same conference room, the echoes of Nathaniel's previous speech still fresh in everyone's minds. Nathaniel began without preamble. "I've reviewed the reports. I've reviewed your records, and I've come to a conclusion. This department has failed to hold itself accountable. That changes today." Bradley bristled. "With all due respect, Chief, you're blowing this out of proportion. One incident doesn't define a department. One incident..." Nathaniel repeated, his tone icy. "You think this is just about what happened to me? This is about every complaint that's been ignored, every resident who's been harassed, every officer who stood by and did nothing." He turned to Ethan. "Officer Miller, you said you regretted staying silent. Why didn't you speak up?" Ethan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to answer. I was scared. Scared of stepping out of line, of going against my training officer." Nathaniel nodded. "That fear is part of the problem. No officer should feel like they have to choose between doing what's right and keeping their job. That's what needs to change." He looked at Bradley next. "As for you, Officer Cooper, your record speaks for itself. You've been given chance after chance to correct your behavior, and you've ignored every one of them. So now, I'm giving you an ultimatum. Either you agree to undergo mandatory bias training and accept a formal reprimand, or you step down." The room was silent. Bradley's jaw tightened, his pride visibly warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and bitter. "Fine, I'll take your damn training, but don't expect me to grovel." Nathaniel's expression didn't waver. I don't care if you grovel, Cooper. I care that you learn. Because if this happens again, you won't get another chance. By the end of the day, the precinct felt like a different place. Nathaniel's decisive actions had sent a clear message. The old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. Some officers resented him for it. Others respected him. But no one doubted that he meant every word he said. Ethan left the building that evening feeling a strange mix of relief and determination. For the first time, he felt like he had a choice, a real choice, to be part of the change Nathaniel was trying to create. As he walked to his car, he saw Nathaniel standing by his own vehicle, gazing out at the city skyline. Ethan hesitated, then approached him. "Chief Brooks," he said quietly. Nathaniel turned, his expression softening slightly. "Miller, what is it?" Ethan shifted his weight, unsure how to begin. I want to do better. I want to be better. And I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to learn." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a good start, Miller. Just remember, being better isn't a one-time decision. It's a choice you make every day." Ethan nodded, his chest feeling a little lighter. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were finally moving in the right direction. 2 weeks after the events that shook the Riverside Police Precinct, the department looked and felt different. The hallways were quieter, the air heavier with the weight of reflection and change. Officers who had laughed at Nathaniel Brooks now avoided eye contact whenever he passed. Those who had remained silent during his mistreatment found themselves questioning their own roles in perpetuating a broken system. Nathaniel had wasted no time implementing reforms. Mandatory bias training had begun for every officer, and complaints previously brushed aside were reopened and investigated. A community oversight board was established, consisting of local leaders and residents, to review incidents of misconduct and ensure transparency. The precinct was no longer insulated from accountability, and everyone felt the shift. Bradley Cooper, once the department's untouchable veteran, had become a ghost of his former self. Stripped of his usual bravado, he attended the bias training sessions, sitting in the back with his arms crossed, his face a mask of irritation. But as the sessions progressed, something began to change. The stories shared by community members during the training, stories of fear, humiliation, and distrust, started to chip away at the wall he had built around himself. One day, during a particularly intense session, a local black pastor named Reverend Gaines shared his story. "I was 15 the first time I was put in handcuffs," Reverend Gaines said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I was walking home from church, wearing my Sunday best. A cop stopped me, said I looked out of place. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a kid. He was looking at a suspect. And that's all I've ever been to men like him. A suspect." Bradley's jaw tightened as he listened, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair. He wanted to look away, to dismiss the man's words as exaggeration, but he couldn't. For the first time, he saw himself in the story, and it wasn't a flattering reflection. After the session ended, Bradley stayed behind, sitting alone in the empty room. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He had always believed he was a good cop, that his actions were justified, but now he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Ethan Miller had begun to find his footing. Under Nathaniel's mentorship, he was slowly learning what it meant to truly serve and protect. He spent time in the community, attending neighborhood meetings and listening to residents' concerns. It wasn't easy and he made mistakes, but he was trying and people noticed. One evening, Ethan and Nathaniel attended a community forum held at a local church. The room was packed with residents eager to voice their frustrations and demand answers. Ethan felt nervous, but Nathaniel's steady presence beside him gave him a sense of purpose. A woman stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "How do we trust you? After everything that's happened, how do we believe that things will actually change?" Nathaniel stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "You have every right to be angry," he said. "You have every right to doubt us. But I can promise you this. I won't stop fighting to make this department what it should be. And I'm not alone. There are people in this room, officers like Ethan Miller, who are just as committed to change. We can't undo the past, but we can build a better future. Together, Ethan looked at the woman, then at the faces in the crowd. Slowly, he stepped up to the microphone. I can't speak for anyone else, but I can tell you this. I'm listening, and I'm willing to do the work to earn your trust. Whatever it takes. The room was silent for a moment. Then a few people began to clap. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As weeks turned into months, the changes Nathaniel had implemented began to take root. The precinct was no longer a fortress of unchecked authority. It was becoming part of the community it served. Officers like Ethan thrived under the new leadership, while others, those resistant to change, chose to leave. Bradley Cooper, however, stayed. He completed his training, attended the meetings, and kept his head down. His pride had taken a hit, but something deeper had been shaken loose. One afternoon, Bradley knocked on Nathaniel's office door. "Come in," Nathaniel called. Bradley stepped inside, his hat in his hands. For a moment he didn't speak, just stood there, shifting awkwardly. "Officer Cooper," Nathaniel said, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" Bradley cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize for everything." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "Go on." Bradley looked down at his hat, his voice low. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I always thought I knew what it meant to be a cop. But I was wrong. I didn't see the harm I was doing, and I didn't want to see it. You made me see it." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It takes courage to admit that, Cooper. More courage than most have." Bradley looked up, his eyes meeting Nathaniel's. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression softening. "That's all I've ever asked." The story of Nathaniel Brooks and the Riverside Police Precinct didn't end with a single moment of triumph. Change was slow and often painful, but it was happening. 1 year later, the precinct hosted an open house for the community, inviting residents to meet the officers and learn about the new programs that had been put in place. Ethan stood at the front, talking to a group of children about the importance of honesty and fairness. Nearby, Bradley was answering questions from parents, his demeanor quieter but more genuine than it had ever been. Nathaniel watched from a distance, a small smile playing on his lips. He knew there was still work to be done. There always would be, but moments like this reminded him why he fought so hard. As the sun set over Charleston, Nathaniel walked out of the precinct and into the city he had sworn to protect. He didn't wear his badge as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of his responsibility to the people. Because justice wasn't about uniforms or authority. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost.